The morning my husband was buried, my mother-in-law handed me a business card. Not a word of comfort. Not a hug. She pressed the card into my palm during the reception, right there in the church hall with the lilies still fresh and the casserole dishes still warm. And she said, very quietly, so no one else could hear, "This is a very quietly, so no one else could hear. This is a very good real estate agent. You should call her soon. The house on Birchwood was never really yours to begin with." I looked down at the card. Then I looked up at her face. She was already turning away to accept condolences from someone else. Her black dress perfect, her pearls perfect, her expression perfectly arranged into grief. My name is Sloan. I'm 32 years old. 6 days ago, I watched my husband of 4 years be lowered into the ground at Riverside Memorial Cemetery in Portland, Oregon, while our golden retriever sat in the car because I didn't have anyone to watch him. His name was Biscuit. My husband had picked that name, thought it was hilarious, refused to change it even when I pointed out that grown adults do not want to shout "Biscuit, come" across a dog park. His name was Bennett. He was 37, a structural engineer who loved bad puns and good coffee and fixing things that weren't technically broken yet, just to be safe. He died of a brain aneurysm on a Tuesday afternoon in March, without warning, without any of the dramatic buildup that death is supposed to give you, so you can prepare. He was at his desk. He was fine. And then he wasn't. The thing nobody tells you about sudden loss is that grief doesn't arrive alone. It brings company. And sometimes that company wears a nice blazer and hands you a real estate card before your husband's body is even cold. My mother-in-law's name is Frances. My father-in-law is Gareth. They live in a colonial on the east side of town that has a 3-car garage and a formal dining room they use, maybe twice a year. They have 2 sons, Bennett, who I married, and his younger brother Owen, who lives 20 minutes away and works in his father's commercial real estate firm. The Caldwells are what you might call Portland old money. Not flashy, not loud about it, but the kind of family where the right schools matter and the right last name matters more. I am not from that world. I grew up in Medford, 3 hours south, in a 2-bedroom house where my dad fixed HVAC units for a living, and my mom taught kindergarten. I put myself through nursing school on loans and scholarships. I met Bennett at a friend's birthday party, and within 10 minutes of talking to him, I thought, this man is genuinely kind. Not performing kindness, actually kind. His family saw me differently. The first time I met them, Frances offered me a glass of white wine and then spent 45 minutes asking questions that weren't really questions. Nursing must be so demanding. Do you plan to keep working after you're married? And Medford is a wonderful little town, very unpretentious. And my personal favorite, delivered with a smile so practiced it could have been laminated, we just want to make sure Bennett's future is secure. He works so hard, it would be a shame for that to be complicated. I smiled. I answered everything politely. In the car on the way home, Bennett said, "I'm sorry. They're a lot." And I said, "It's okay," because I loved him and because I thought, the way you always do when you're young and in love, that things would get better. They didn't get better. They didn't get better. They just got more refined in their cruelty. When we got engaged, Gareth pulled Bennett aside. I didn't know about that conversation for 2 more years. Not until Bennett told me himself one night when we were lying in bed, and he'd had a glass of scotch too many, and got quiet in that way. He sometimes did. His father had suggested a prenuptial agreement. Specifically, Gareth had said, "She seems lovely, but she doesn't bring much to the table. The Birchwood house is family money. I'd hate to see it walk out the door if things don't work out." Bennett had refused. He'd been furious. He didn't tell me at the time because he didn't want it to poison the beginning of our marriage. But he remembered it. He filed it away. And quietly, without making a big thing of it, he started making plans. I didn't know that yet. That part comes later, the worst moment before Bennett died. And I say before, because after changes everything. Was Christmas, our 2nd year of marriage. I had spent 3 weeks making his mother a memory book. I know how that sounds. I know. But I was trying. I printed photos, wrote little captions, found pictures from Bennett's childhood that I'd scanned when he wasn't looking, put it all together in one of those linen-covered albums from the bookstore downtown. It took me every spare evening for a month. Frances opened it at the dining table in front of the whole family. She looked at each page. She said, "Oh, how thoughtful." Then she set it aside, reached under the table, and produced a flat white box tied with a navy ribbon. She handed it to Bennett. Inside was a vintage watch, a Patek Philippe, the kind of watch that has its own insurance policy. "This was your grandfather's," she said, her voice full of something genuine for the first time all evening. "It's yours now. You've earned it." The album sat on the side table for the rest of the night. When we were leaving, I watched Frances hand it to their housekeeper, Dolores, who looked confused and a little embarrassed. "Take this if you'd like it," Frances said, the way you'd offer someone a slightly wilted houseplant. I got in the car. I did not cry. I stared out the window at the lights on the Burnside Bridge, and I thought, I could keep trying for the rest of my life and it will never matter. Bennett reached over and took my hand without saying anything. He always knew. The thing I didn't know, the thing that changes this whole story, happened about 6 months before he died. We were in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, Bennett making French toast while I read the paper, and he said, very casually, "I want to talk to you about something." He turned down the burner. He wiped his hands on the dish towel, and he told me he'd been meeting with a lawyer. Her name was Priscilla Vance. He described her as a woman who looks like someone's grandmother and negotiates like a Navy SEAL, which turned out to be the most accurate description of another human being I've ever heard. He'd been consulting with her twice a year for almost 3 years, since the Christmas after the watch incident. Since the night he held my hand on the bridge, he sat down across from me at the table, and he slid a folder across the surface. Inside were documents I had never seen. Deeds, financial records, a will. "The house is in joint tenancy with right of survivorship," he said. "It was my parents' contribution toward the down payment, but the title has been restructured. The moment anything happens to me, it's yours automatically. It doesn't go through probate. They can't contest it." I stared at him. "Bennett, I need you to listen to all of it," he said, and something in his voice made me go still. "There's also the investment account, the business partnership stake, and the life insurance. All of it is structured so it transfers directly. Priscilla has the originals. She has my instructions." I asked him why he'd done this without telling me. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the folder, then at me. "Because I didn't want you to feel like you had to be on guard. I wanted you to just be my wife. And I needed to handle this like an engineer. Quietly, correctly, with no room for error." He pulled out one more thing. A sealed envelope with my name on the front in his handwriting. "Don't open this unless you need to," he said. "Priscilla will know when." I put it in the fireproof box in the closet where we keep our passports. I thought about it sometimes, late at night, in the way you think about something you don't want to look at too closely. I didn't think I'd need it soon. I thought we had time. We didn't have time. The aneurysm came 7 months after that Sunday morning. He was at his desk at 2 in the afternoon. The paramedics were there in 9 minutes. It wasn't enough. And then it was 6 days later, and I was standing in the church hall, holding a business card from a real estate agent named Hendricks and Shaw, while my mother-in-law accepted condolences from people whose names I'd never learned. I didn't call the number on the card. I went home. I fed Biscuit. I sat in the kitchen for a long time in the dark. Then I got up, went to the closet, took out the fireproof box, and I looked at the envelope with my name on it for a while without opening it. I put it back. I went to bed. I told myself to wait and see what they did next. I didn't have to wait long. 3 days after the funeral, my father-in-law called. He had the smooth, reassuring voice of someone who has spent decades in commercial real estate. A voice designed to make unreasonable things sound sensible. He said he wanted to come by to discuss the situation with the property. He said they'd been speaking to their estate attorney. He said he hoped we could handle this like adults, as family. "Of course," I said. "Saturday works." I called Priscilla Vance that afternoon. She answered on the second ring. I'd only met her once, at Bennett's insistence about a year before he died, just so you two know each other. Now I understood why he'd arranged that meeting, "Sloan," she said, and her voice was calm and specific in a way that immediately made me feel less like I was drowning. "I've been expecting your call. Tell me what's happening." I told her about the business card, the phone call from Gareth, the phrase, the situation with the property. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good, let them come. I want to be there." Saturday morning, Gareth and Francis arrived at 9. Owen came too, which I had not expected. He had a legal pad. He sat down at the kitchen table like he was chairing a meeting. Gareth opened. He said that the house had been purchased in part with family funds. He said that Bennett had always intended for the property to remain in the Caldwell family. He said that he and Francis had been speaking with their attorney and that given the circumstances, they believed the equitable and appropriate resolution was for me to vacate the property within 60 days so that Owen and his wife could move in. He used the word equitable 4 times. He never once said he was sorry for my loss. Frances sat with her hands folded and said nothing. She looked at the countertops. Owen had a document. He slid it across the table. It was a proposed property transfer agreement. Somewhere in the middle, in the kind of small font that requires reading glasses, was a clause in which I would agree to relinquish any claim to the house in exchange for a one-time payment of $40,000. I looked at the document. I looked at Owen. I looked at Gareth. "I appreciate you coming," I said. My voice was level. I had practiced this in the bathroom that morning. "I think we should wait for my attorney." Gareth's expression shifted. "You have an attorney?" "She'll be here in about 4 minutes," I said. Priscilla Vance arrived in a silver Volvo, wearing a cardigan the color of oatmeal and carrying a leather briefcase that had to be older than I was. She looked exactly like someone's grandmother. She took off her reading glasses when she walked in, tucked them in her pocket, and shook Garrett's hand with the brisk efficiency of someone who had no time for preamble. She sat down at the table, opened her briefcase, and placed 3 documents in front of Gareth, with the kind of precision that is its own form of communication. "Let's begin," she said. She walked them through the joint tenancy filing first. She showed them the date it had been restructured, 3 years prior. She explained, in the patient and slightly condescending tone of someone who has done this many times before, what right of survivorship means, what it cannot be contested on, and what the legal consequences of pressuring a surviving spouse to vacate their own property actually look like in the state of Oregon. Gareth tried to interrupt twice. She let him finish both times and then continued exactly where she'd left off, as if he hadn't spoken at all. She then produced the will, notarized, witnessed by a judge and 2 partners at her firm. She did not read it aloud yet. She simply placed it on the table where everyone could see it and said, "This document bequeaths all remaining assets to Sloan. It contains a no contest clause. Anyone who challenges it in court will be immediately and entirely disinherited. That means everything, down to personal items Bennett may have intended as sentimental gifts." Owen's legal pad sat untouched. Frances finally spoke. She said, "This is not what Bennett would have wanted." Her voice had something in it I'd never heard before. Not anger. Something closer to fear. Priscilla looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Actually, I think you should hear what Bennett wanted," in his own words. She reached into the briefcase and produced the sealed envelope, the one from the fireproof box that I had brought her the week before, as she had instructed. My name was on the front in his handwriting. She broke the seal carefully, the way you open something that matters. She unfolded the single page inside and put her reading glasses back on. She read, "Francis, Gareth, Owen." His voice in her voice, strange and real at the same time. "If Priscilla is reading this, it means you did exactly what I knew you would do. I want you to understand something, so I'm going to say it plainly because I am tired of watching my family speak plainly to everyone except the people who deserve honesty the most." Frances's hands tightened in her lap. "You have spent 4 years looking at my wife and seeing a liability. You saw her student loans and her background and her lack of a family name, and you decided she was a variable you needed to manage. You were wrong. Sloan is the only person in my life who has ever loved me without conditions attached. She loved me before the inheritance, before the partnership stake, before any of it ever became relevant. You could not say the same." Priscilla paused. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Biscuit was asleep in the corner and did not know that any of this was happening. "Mom," her voice reading his, "the Christmas album she made you. I saw you give it to Dolores. I saw Sloane's face. I didn't say anything that night, and I have regretted it since. That album took her a month. She made it for you because she was still trying. She never stopped trying. You never started." Frances made a sound. Not quite a word. "Dad, you asked me to consider a prenuptial agreement because you wanted to protect the family's assets. Let me be clear about what that sentence means. It means you valued the house on Birchwood more than you valued my marriage. That is a thing I cannot forgive, and I have spent 3 years making sure it doesn't matter." Gareth sat very still. Sloane was never a complication in the Caldwell story. She was the best thing in mine. And this house, this life, everything Priscilla has in that briefcase, it belongs to her, not as a gift, as a fact, as what she has earned by being my partner when it would have been entirely reasonable for her to walk away. Priscilla turned the page. One more paragraph. She read it the way you'd read something sacred. "I know this isn't what you wanted. I also know you'll get over it because Caldwells always do. In the meantime, Priscilla has her instructions. The house is Sloane's. The accounts are Sloane's. And if any of you make one more move against her, the last thing I built will be the legal case that strips every courtesy I would have otherwise extended. I hope it doesn't come to that. I hope you'll remember at some point that you lost a son and decide not to lose everything else too." She set the page down. The room stayed quiet. Gareth looked at the table. Not at me, not at Frances. At the table, Owen picked up his legal pad, looked at it, and then put it back down without writing anything. Frances stood up. She didn't say anything. She walked to the window and looked out at the yard, at the Japanese maple Bennett had planted the first spring we lived there, because I'd mentioned once, casually, that I liked them. She stood there for a while. Then she turned around. She looked at me, really looked at me, in a way she never had before. 4 years of Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings and birthday parties, and she had never once looked at me like I was a real person, standing in her room. "He was right," she said. Her voice was stripped of everything, the polish, the performance, the perfect arrangement. About the album. I didn't say anything. "I knew when I handed it to Dolores," she said. "I knew." She picked up her purse. She touched Gareth on the shoulder, barely, just a brush of her fingers. He stood. Owen stood. Priscilla held the door. When they were gone, I stood in my kitchen for a long time. The sun was coming through the window above the sink, the way it does in early spring in Portland, sideways in pale gold, and Biscuit woke up from his nap and wandered over and put his head on my knee. I don't know exactly when things started to shift after that. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single morning I woke up and felt like I was standing on solid ground. It was more like the difference between white-knuckling something and simply holding it. The tension going out of your hands so slowly you don't notice until it's gone. The 60-day eviction notice that never came. The property transfer agreement that went unsigned and unreturned. The silence from the Caldwell family that felt, at first, ominous, and then just present. A fact of the landscape. I went back to work. I am a nurse in the cardiac unit at OHSU, and there is something to be said for work that requires your full attention in a way that leaves no room for circling thoughts. My colleagues had sent flowers. The unit manager had given me 3 weeks without asking, just told me to take them. I came back on a Monday and the attending physician shook my hand and said, "Glad you're here," and meant it in a way that had nothing to do with staffing ratios. About 2 months after the funeral, I got a letter from Frances. Not a legal document. A letter, 3 pages, handwritten on her good stationery, the cream kind with the little embossed F in the corner. I read it standing in the hallway with my coat still on. She wrote about Bennett as a child, things I'd never known. That he used to sleepwalk until he was 9, that he'd once cried for 40 minutes over a bird that flew into their sliding glass door, that he'd taught himself to play piano by ear during a summer when he was 12, and then abandoned it entirely and never mentioned it again. She wrote about the day he called her and told her he was going to propose to me, and how she'd said the wrong thing in response, and how she'd known, even as she said it, that it was wrong. She did not offer excuses. She offered facts. She closed by saying, "I am not asking for anything. I don't think I have the right to ask for anything. But I wanted you to know things about him that I thought you'd want to know. And I wanted to say plainly that I was wrong about you. I was wrong from the beginning. I am sorry." I sat with that letter for a long time. I didn't write back right away. I'm still not sure I've fully decided what I want that to look like, if anything. There are things Frances did that a letter doesn't erase, but there are also things I know about grief now that I didn't know 4 months ago, and one of them is that it makes people do strange things. Some of them terrible, some of them eventually honest. I found the second thing Bennett left me on a Sunday in May. I was cleaning out his home office, which I had been avoiding for weeks. Working slowly through the bookshelves and the flat files and the boxes of drafting supplies he had never thrown away because he believed everything was eventually useful. In the back of the bottom drawer of his desk, tucked behind a folder of old tax returns, was a small wooden box. Inside the box was a handwritten note on a folded piece of graph paper, his preferred medium for anything he considered important. It said, "The key is to the safety deposit box at First Federal on Morrison. Ask for Harriet. She knows to expect you." I went on a Tuesday morning. Harriet was a small woman with silver hair and a lanyard full of badges who did not seem surprised to see me at all. She led me back and unlocked the box and left me alone with it. Inside was a stack of documents, copies of everything Priscilla already had, and a second envelope. This one said, "For when the hard part is over." I opened it right there, in the small room with the fluorescent light and the hum of the building around me. Sloan. If you're reading this, it means Priscilla did her job and you did yours, and the house is still yours, and Biscuit is probably fine. Here's what I want you to do now. I want you to take the investment account, the one in the folder marked blue, and I want you to use the first distribution to do whatever you have been putting off, because it seemed impractical or too much for just you. Not a vacation. Not something responsible. Something you actually want. You'll know what it is. I did know what it was. For 2 years, I'd been quietly looking at a small building on Alberta Street that had been a bakery, and then a yoga studio, and then nothing. It had good light and a separate entrance, and the previous tenant had left behind a small reception desk that was bolted to the floor, which I had always thought was funny. I had a vague, unspoken idea about a community space, somewhere people could come, a nurse's version of what Bennett's structural work was, load-bearing, steady, designed to keep things from collapsing. 3 months later, I signed a lease. I don't have a grand name for it yet. Right now, it's just a room with good light and folding chairs, and a schedule that I post on the door each Monday. On Tuesday evenings, there's a grief support group that a therapist I know from the hospital runs for free. On Saturday mornings, there's a cooking class for people who are learning to cook for one after spending years cooking for two. On Thursday afternoons, a retired pharmacist comes in and answers questions about medications and insurance, the kind of questions people are embarrassed to ask doctors. It is not finished. It is probably not what Bennett imagined, whatever he imagined, but I think it is in the right direction. The Japanese maple in the front yard put out leaves this spring for the first time since I planted it. I hadn't actually expected it to survive. Bennett had warned me when he put it in that first spring that I would probably forget to water it at the right times, and that was okay. They were more resilient than they looked. He was right about that too. I still talk to him sometimes, not in a mystical way. I'm a cardiac nurse. I have a fairly grounded relationship with mortality. But in the way you talk to someone who knew you well, when you want to report back, when something goes right or goes sideways, or when Biscuit does something absurd at the dog park that Bennett would have found genuinely hilarious. I tell him about the building. I tell him we got a good deal on the chairs. I tell him the pharmacist, whose name is Harold and who is 81 years old and should by all rights have retired completely, shows up 15 minutes early every single Thursday and moves the chairs into exactly the right configuration before anyone else arrives. And that watching him do that is one of the most quietly beautiful things I have ever seen in my life. I held the line, Bennett. The hard part is over. Now I'm building something on it,